In this lecture, I will walk you through the SDKs and the APIs within that SDKs we require to implement this asynchronous use case. By looking at this use case, you can derive the dependencies or the SDKs that are required. One is SNS because our Lambda function is going to write to SNS. Two, we need the S3 SDK as well. I'll explain why. If you go to the project, you're going to create the project, then add two SDKs. The first SDK is the S3 SDK. Earlier we had the DynamoDB SDK for synchronous use case, and then the SNS SDK. And along with those two, we have the events. The first Lambda function is the patient checkout Lambda function, which will receive the following data. Nope, it won't receive that data. We are going to upload that data as a file to S3. The Lambda function will be triggered and it will receive a S3 event. The event will not have the file information. It will have the info about the file. It will not have this data itself. The patient data will not be there. It is the responsibility of our Lambda function to use the information within this event. So this event will have records. Usually there is only one record, but there is that option for multiple records. So we'll loop through it, but we receive only one record. Once we receive that record within the event will have the S3 bucket name and the key that will be assigned to that object that just got created when you upload the file. Using that information and using the S3 client, see this guy, Amazon S3. This is the API from SDK. Use the client builder, create a S3 client. Once you have the bucket information and the file information, you can read that file information as an object using this S3 client that will return you a S3 object input stream. Just like file input stream, S3 object input stream again is from the S3 SDK. See this import. That guy can be used to read the entire file. We pass that input stream as a parameter to the object mapper, the Jackson object mapper. That guy will read that input stream, convert it into a list of patient checkout events. This patient checkout event is a POJO that you create. This guy will have the mapping to the data that comes in as JSON. So the Jackson mapper will convert the data that we are reading from the S3 bucket into list of Java objects. Then we loop through those list of Java objects, use the SNS client and publish events to the SNS client by serializing the Java objects into JSON. So the SNS client again is very simple. You create the SNS client up top, just like how you create DynamoDB client or S3 client. So remember, we are going to use two SDKs. One SDK to read the file information from S3 when the event is triggered. The second SDK is to publish events to SNS. In the second Lambda function, again, we use the SNS API. See this, we don't need the API here. We receive the event. That event will have the information that is published to SNS topic. So we simply get those events or the messages out of the event that got fired when the SNS receives a topic from this first Lambda.